it's one of my props of speaking is that I move around a lot to kind of keep people on the edge so they don't fall asleep. They never know if I'm going to walk up and thump them on the head or not. So, and I feel more comfortable. I feel trapped if I'm sitting at a desk. Now, how many of you think that we live in a world that's overregulated? That was a TED. See, that's a TED thing. Yeah, I picked it. Thank you. Well, it really depends on what you mean by regulation. And what I'm going to try to do is provide a sort of framework to get other people to think differently about regulation, which maybe might help some of you as well. So, look, this doesn't want to work. Oh, there we go. So we're going to look at regulating human action. Regulation should be about protecting the integrity of the individual liberty and human dignity. That's the beginning point for me. So whenever we talk about regulation, whether it's, and as you'll see in a moment, I'm going to differentiate between what we call government or imposed regulation and voluntary or private regulations, which would be customs and common law and other things like that. But all of them are about trying to maintain, or at least should be, about trying to maintain and allow human beings to flourish. And from the economist standpoint, of course, we're concerned about economic efficiency. But from a moral perspective, we could talk about other social gains as well. Now, so there's two basic approaches here. The first one would be what you would call government or political control. And this is imposed by some outside force. So the government involves some elite group that decides what's best for everyone, whether or not whether or not the elite group themselves are being regulated. Everyone else is. So these are government-imposed rules and statutory regulations that have force behind them, the monopoly of the legal use of violence. Then we have voluntary self-regulation, and this is what my friend John Chisholm calls organic regulation. That is, it's a spontaneous development, very Hayekian. Why not? Well, it's your little. Okay, here we go. Okay. So what we have with voluntary is decentralized human actions, spontaneous order. People plan their own life. Now, what we discover from this is that government regulators distrust people. They don't think that you have free will. So they think that they are the ones that must create guidelines for your human behavior. Whereas this organic approach is where we discover through our human actions and interactions what serves us best. And so instead of legislation guiding us, we're guided instead by the rule of law, which is a metaphysical, evolutionary, spontaneous development of legal controls. So what we have there, instead of force, we have voluntary action. Now, and part of the important thing about this panel, of course, is that we understand that trying to reduce the risk of harm to zero will lead to an exponentially growing cost. I'll show you in a moment. So as the closer we get risk to zero, the higher the cost will be, and they'll rise at an asymptotic rate. So the optimal risk, according to economists then, would be to use something, and again, this is problematic in itself, but a cost-benefit analysis that gives us some guidelines. Now, what we find is that political agents, bureaucrats, politicians, elected officials, tend to be insensitive to these costs because they don't bear them. So these costs are borne by the rest of the community. As a consequence of that, we tend to see overregulation in the first category of government regulation. Now, here was a nice little quote I got, and it deals with something with fraud in particular, but I think we could use the idea of risk reduction here as well, that if you try to get this to zero, nothing will happen. And it just becomes overwhelming. So this is what happens. If you lower the risk of harm close to zero, the costs rise dramatically. So it's the same whether we're talking about air pollution reduction. If you want to reduce air pollution, getting the first 90 or 95% out of the smokestacks is quite not very high in cost. But once you start going up 1% more, 1% more, 1% more, the costs rise very dramatically. So at some point, we find that we will be overregulated when costs reach somewhere in that region. So let's look then at these state-imposed legislated rules. They're dictated by a few people. It's a committee, an elite, experts, whatever you might call them, at a specific moment. Now, this is very interesting because almost all legislation is based upon a momentary majority that decided on the given political group that is in power. They were motivated by passions of the moment, 9/11. That would, why?
Because when you're here, you're out of range of the mic.
Oh, okay. This guy's a technician. He's also a regulator. Regulating my action. So, thank you, Richard. I broke my train of thought. So a momentary majority generated by the passions of the moment, or directed by political ideology, or some ideological fashion, or partisan principle, but that legislation and that regulation tends to be permanent, even though it may not be relevant any longer. And that the majority has moved on. There's a different type of majority, which has no longer driven by those partisan guidelines. So this is an important issue here. Solve this one, Richard. Okay, well, there we go. So what is the nature of this? State regulation tends to be static, backward-looking, inflexible, complex. And then we contrast that, or we take it further. It promotes narrow ideological and political goals. It protects the integrity of the status quo. These are special interest group, public choice kind of problems. It imposes compliance costs, which in the United States, the compliance costs are vastly greater than the budgetary costs or the other direct costs of regulatory requirements. It leads to it's open to regulatory capture, and it tends to expand and perpetuate political power, which in many ways is what it's about. Now let's look at organic regulation. Organic regulation tends to operate within either what you could call the common law or more broadly the rule of law, based on human nature, and it evolves based on human actions and interactions. So these are cooperative agreements these cooperative agreements are evolutionary, they're forward-looking, they're flexible, they're simple. So we contrast that with the state. The state is 180 degrees opposite in terms of their regulatory processes. So voluntary self-regulation based on cooperation evolves out of experience of those who are directly affected. So we have industrial guidelines, or we have industrial agreements with the importance of protecting reputation. That this in the economic sphere is crucial. Nike only owns the swoosh. They own no manufacturing facilities. Their entire net worth depends upon the integrity of their brand. They will do whatever they can and must to protect the brand. So this is a very strong regulator of corporate behavior. That is the concern for something that would diminish the value of their brand. They avoid that with great alacrity. Media reporting makes it transparent. The media doesn't really make regulatory behavior and from the state that transparent. They don't care. It's a rule, so why should we question it? Whereas if there is an industrial standard, they will investigate it and explore it and try to reveal it for the advantages to the group that's concerned. So what we have is often independent private professional associations, rating agencies. And what happens, these tend to reduce economic power. Whereas state-imposed regulations perpetuate political power and expand it. In fact, it's one of the realities of life that we need to also, I think, in this group, communicate better, that the only power we need to really fear in life is political power, because it tends to reproduce itself and perpetuate itself. Economic power cannot be perpetuated unless it is done with the connivance of the political authorities. Markets destroy monopoly. The dynamism of the market, the changing preferences of the consumers, changing technology, the mortality of the founding entrepreneur, all these things undermine economic power. So this is something we need to communicate better. So to evaluate the outcomes of regulation, the aspect of the state-imposed regulation, it tends to be because of weak accountability of the regulators. What happens? We have inefficient regulation. The financial crisis of 2008 was said to be the outcome of deregulating the financial sector. This is one of the most uninformed remarks of all times. Although there was a minor change in the banking regulation in the United States, the banking sector is the most heavily regulated sector of the entire U.S. economy. There's 100,000 bureaucrats working in it that spends millions, tens of millions of dollars every year, and they missed everything. They were completely ineffective in being on top of what was happening in the banking sector. Morality. One of the realities of life is that any action that you take that is based on coercion can never be deemed moral. The only moral act is an act of voluntary human decisions. So if I, as a politician, believe that what I'm doing and causing you to do is based upon my moral requirements, you pursuing them on the basis of the implied force, you cannot declare that a moral action, nor can the politician declare the outcome as a moral action, because it required the use of or the reliance of force on the people being regulated. Justice. The regulations and redistribution, which is what politics is all about. Politics is about redistributing resources, taking from one group to give to another. This leads to injustices. I think most people in this room would see this very clearly, but this again is something we need to, I think one of the pressure points that we need to stress when we talk about regulation. So in the end, individual liberty, human liberty becomes less important than some group goals, and it takes some sort of strange calculus that only social democrats can come up with to declare that somehow there's some net gains in terms of social justice. When we look at markets, on the other hand, markets tend to deliver efficiency because of the nature of the incentives that are at play in the market. Totally different incentives. Public officials tend to be very difficult to fire or replace, whereas in the private sector, this is a much more effective. Morality, only voluntary acts can be deemed moral. So government-imposed regulation, by definition, cannot lead to moral outcomes, except maybe perhaps by accident. But in fact, we cannot, as a matter of metaphysical description, deem them to be moral. Justice. Well, voluntary or organic regulation is the outcome of human action and evolutionary that supports private property and human liberty, so that there's equal treatment, no privileges, which is what the basis of the rule of law is. Now, there's a lot of different types of regulation, and this is what I was saying earlier. We could also not only talk about state or imposed regulation versus private, but we could talk about economic regulation versus cultural or social regulation. So here we're talking about social regulation, where shame, the loss of face in the Asian context. I don't know how many of you are aware of the how this idea of shame and face operates in Asia. In Japan, in the wake of the economic crisis there back in the 90s, business owners that bankrupt suicided rather than facing their employees or their fellow men because of the loss of faith. So it can be a very effective regulatory tool. Mutual voluntary agreement, moral restraint, use of private adjudication or mediation tends to be much stronger than the feedback, so that there's more flexible adaptation and more rapid change in the overall environment. There's incentives for people with intimate knowledge, the people that have, in the Hayekian sense, relevant knowledge to seek the regulatory benefits while minimizing the costs. So I think, again, it won't be a hard sell in this audience to say that less government regulation will not necessarily lead to the chaos or the abuse by individuals or firms, because there are out there other regulating mechanisms. And what we find is that voluntary regulation does not tend to expand on its own. The economic theory of bureaucracy within the public choice literature describes to us why bureaucratic and regulatory agencies grow based upon their own internal requirements rather than the requirements of the community, which is, on one hand, as Barbara suggested in the beginning, we're supposed to have regulation imposed by the state in order to protect consumers or whatever. But in fact, what we have, much of the regulation, is just simply to satisfy the internal requirements of the bureaucracy. They're budget maximizers. So if we want to reduce or eliminate the externality of government regulation, then we need to rely much more heavily on private regulation. So what we could have is either, wrapping it up. What we know is that before there were government regulations, there were industry standards. So this was not, again, if we go back before in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, very little was done in Washington in terms of regulating the general population. In terms of the economic activities, was done primarily at the industry level. Many areas of life are covered. NASCAR, by the way. Is anybody a scuba diver? Yes. PADI? There's all kinds of activity. Scuba diving can be very dangerous, but it's regulated by a private agency, and it works very well. There's lots of examples. Underwriters Laboratory, you probably know about that. Underwriters Laboratory, which oversees literally billions of items every year, they do it with 9,000 people in 200 laboratories. It's a private firm, and they help regulate the electronic industry. Voluntary regulation, this could be a sell to governments if they wanted to reduce overall costs, which they primarily don't want to do. So someone brought up the case of the black man in New York City that was selling cigarettes one by one on the street. I think it was, you may or may not know about it. But the police tried to restrain him, and in the process they killed him. Now they killed him because that was the law, that they were able to stop this man to regulate his behavior so that he wouldn't sell cigarettes one by one on the street because the city of New York wanted to collect taxes on cigarettes. So the point of this is, don't request a regulation that you're not willing to kill for. And I think this is an interesting message to try to put to people, because ultimately it has the potential of violence behind it. He resisted because he thought it was nonsense that they would stop him, and they murdered him, murdered by police. So I will move on if I can. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Sorry.
Careful. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I hand over to Paul. And Paul, could you just cover the topic of harm reduction a little bit, and what we have to await on this front?
Sure. So starting at is this on? No.
Yes.
Yes.
Then the lights on.
Cool. Starting at the kind of 30,000 foot perspective on the subject of harm reduction, it's not a new subject. If you look at things like contraception and needle exchanges, things like the use of naloxone for heroin addiction, these concepts are not new. It's not necessarily innovation that brought on this new discussion, but innovation in the tobacco space has kind of changed the political dynamic of groups and constituencies that broadly advocate for harm reduction. So on things like needle exchanges and contraceptions or contraceptive and naloxone in the United States, these are largely policies and practices that have been advocated for by the American political left. Starting in San Francisco during the AIDS epidemic, evolving even recently with the opioid issues across the United States, it's not necessarily been a policy in terms of the use of government force, whether it's resources or regulations, that has been embraced by the American political right because it's not necessarily innovation or new products or the free market that created these incentive structures or issues. Where this has entirely been flipped on its head has been the emergence of e-cigarettes and vaping and technologies in the tobacco space. And what's been interesting here is looking back on how these products really became popular, both in the U.S. and around the world. I mean, technology's not really existed in widespread use, but for the last 10 years. I don't think that we necessarily had products in the U.S. Predating 2009, which is when the first major comprehensive legislation and regulatory framework was created for the regulation of the tobacco industry broadly, and then more recently reinterpreted to include e-cigarettes or vapor products. On the subject of what the U.S. and world is getting right and wrong, Chris made the point that shame is an effective regulatory tool, and historically that's been among, other than tax increases or misguided policies like plain packaging, or all of the sort of disincentive structures created by the government to discourage smokers from using these products. Shame has been a very effective tool at unfortunately reducing both access and interest in using tobacco products. Unfortunately, that same strategy is being used around the world to discourage people from using products, e-cigarettes for example, that are 95 to 99% less harmful. In fact, in 2016, when our Food and Drug Administration reinterpreted the definition of a tobacco product to also include tobacco-derived products, nicotine largely comes from tobacco. You can get it from eggplants, but in industrial use and commercial forms, it comes from tobacco plants. They not only defined the products as tobacco, but said that if you had a product on the market or wanted to introduce a product onto the market in the future, you had to get permission from the government to do so. And the process, designed over the course of 15 years of negotiations between tobacco companies and public health, was essentially designed to end in failure. When Congress passed and President Obama signed the Tobacco Control Act, the process was not designed to make it easy to bring new tobacco products onto the market. And that was somewhat by design. I mean, there's not necessarily an incentive structure to allow, for public health perspectives, the introduction of new products. However, in changing the definition of tobacco products and subjecting a whole new industry to this regulatory capture, in the U.S. we have tens of thousands of products currently on the market that by 2022 will be illegal unless the FDA gives permission to the manufacturers of these products to allow the products to stay on the market. And what's interesting about this whole thing is that cigarettes still protected. There's no regulatory barrier to keeping cigarettes on the market. And of course, I don't advocate for removing the products from the market, But the alternatives that are 95 to 99% less harmful are up against a 2021 and 2022 deadline that would make all of these products illegal. And we have outgoing commissioner, next commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, that has said that even if there is a harm reduction benefit to adult, in the U.S. we have 37 million American adults that still use cigarettes, even if there is a benefit to consumers transitioning away from cigarettes onto products like e-cigarettes or even other harm reduction tobacco products on the market, that the risk of teens using these products, and in the U.S., I think the data last year showed that about 2 million teens experimented with them. Not necessarily that they're regular users, but that they'd use the products. They reported in surveys done by the government that they'd use the products. That risk is far more important and detrimental to public health generally than the potential for millions of adults transitioning away from cigarettes onto alternatives. And part of this goes to another point that Chris was making about the quit or die principle, and that there's no middle ground for the appropriate regulatory treatment of an industry. And obviously this has pretty significant potential public health consequences. Until about 2009, smoking rates had flatlined in the United States. And then after them, we saw pretty significant declines. In fact, youth use of cigarettes is at a historic low. We're around the 14 to 15% range of cigarette use in the United States. Compare that to Moldova. I think the recent data that I looked at from the World Bank is something anywhere between 35 and 45% of men in this country use cigarettes, much lower with women. But in Moldova, there actually is a greater embrace of harm reduction. I was out last night and saw IQOS, one example of these products. And there are a number of companies that have these new generation heat-not-burn products. But when it comes to the concept of harm reduction, what is interesting is that countries have pursued the precautionary principle because the way that regulations have generally governed their treatment of the tobacco industry is to push for prohibition, limitations on access, higher costs, whether that's excise taxes or fees for being a manufacturer. And none of that has been successful. In fact, in some cases, we've seen it work to the opposite effect of not reducing smoking rates. And so there is a great opportunity for taxpayer savings, for improvements in public health, and a little bit about how Americans for Tax Reform started getting involved in these fights a couple of years ago. It started with excise taxes. Initially, there was an effort, and there is a global effort to subject these new generation products to the same taxes as traditional tobacco products and cigarettes. Number one, I reject the premise that taxes should be used to coerce consumer behavior. But if you accept that taxes should coerce consumer behavior in some way, taxes should reflect the relative risk of products subject to taxes. And so when you look at cigarette rates in the United States, they vary significantly state by state, city by city. Tax Foundation does some great work looking at some of the impacts of these excise taxes. I think New York, it's in excess of 50% of all products consumed in the state are either imported in, black market, illicit trade, and that's because the taxes are so high. I think in New York City, it's much higher than that. New York State, it's above 50%. And those are the sorts of impacts that taxes have. But in the United States, and certainly around the world as well, there's an effort to subject these products, again, 95 to 99% less harmful, to the same tax rates. Which sends a horrible message to consumers. Number one, that they shouldn't be using these products. And number two, when you look at the constituencies and consumer groups and demographics, particularly in the United States, that are tobacco users, that are smokers, they're disproportionately low income. And so you're raising costs on consumers who can least afford price fluctuations in terms of their choice between products. And so instead of encouraging people to use these products, we're using tax policy, we're using regulatory policy to discourage them from doing so. Much different approach than much of Europe and the United Kingdom, which has taken a much more robust approach. Royal College of Physicians and Public Health England has obviously encouraged smokers to use these products. and certainly ahead of the curve when it came to smoking. Royal College of Physicians was in the 60s, and is on vaping as well. But there are significant risks in getting this wrong. Significant risk, again, both to taxpayers and public health. I mean, we spend billions of dollars on social welfare programs through Medicaid and Medicare treating smoking-related disease and illness in the United States. And the very innovations that could reduce these costs and improve these outcomes are being discouraged by the same public health groups that have long advocated for the quit or die approach in principle, and refuse to embrace the fact that there is a continuum of risk. Because we have this unfortunate thought in the tobacco space, dissimilar from things like needle exchanges or contraception or naloxone when it comes to heroin use, that there are only two options: using products that are currently available or entirely quitting. There's no middle ground. And that's what the current regulatory treatment of the vaping industry is in the United States. And there are significant consequences to getting this wrong long term. Because smoking rates, again, did not begin to significantly decline until these products became much more widespread in the United States. And I think there's been varying degrees of success on these new generation products as well, whether it's heated tobacco, whether it's smokeless tobacco and snus, or whether it's the newer generation e-cigarettes. But in the United States, you cannot introduce new products to market. If you, as a manufacturer, design a product that is less harmful to consumers, or design a device that is more consumer friendly, you're not allowed to bring that product to market without permission from the FDA. And to date, our Food and Drug Administration has not given permission to a single manufacturer to bring a product on the market. Swedish Match applied for application to effectively advertise their products as reduced risk. But not a single manufacturer in the United States has gotten permission from the FDA to advertise these products as less harmful than cigarettes. And so not only is there the regulatory capture that sets up a deadline of 2021 for prohibition for tens of thousands of products in the United States, but our government refuses to allow companies to truthfully advertise these products as reduced risk. And so we're not only sending the wrong message to consumers that they should not be using these products or that they should not quit. In many cases, our government is spending tax dollars, user fees, excise tax collections, to lie to consumers about the risk profile of these products. I was at an event with FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, I think 2 weeks ago, and he was asked about this, about why the government refuses to accurately inform adult consumers that these are products that they should be experimenting with, trying out, looking to as alternatives to cigarettes, if that's something that they wanted to do. And he went back to the principle that we cannot allow this, they've labeled it a youth use epidemic. I've always understood the term epidemic to mean there's actual public health harm. I don't know what it necessarily is when it comes to nicotine, which has been approved by the FDA and many government agencies around the world for lifelong use on things like the patch, the lozenge, the gum, as other nicotine replacement therapies. But they are so risk averse, based on the precautionary principle, to allowing adults to use these products or allowing kids to use these products. Obviously, we don't want that. But that risk and trade-off, Commissioner Gottlieb asked, well, what is the appropriate, or what is the level of teen experimentation we should accept as a trade-off for allowing these products to remain on the market? And it's a baffling question because on a cost-benefit analysis perspective, if millions of adults, 470,000 in the United States, die annually of cigarette use, transition away from cigarettes onto e-cigarettes or smokeless tobacco and snus or other these new generation products, the public health benefit so far outweighs youth experimentation that we are clearly moving away from an evidence-based approach to regulation and pursuing a moral crusade against an industry that in many cases is saying, we're less interested in selling cigarettes today than we were 5-10 years ago. And there is no embrace of innovation or free market principles from the public health apparatus in the United States, which it's not necessarily been the case until I think the emergence of these new generation products and technologies in the United States. But for us, I mean, these began as excise tax fights. They evolved into this regulatory capture debate and issue when the FDA changed the definition of a tobacco product. But the point that I'll end on is, relating back to my first point about how this has changed politics in the United States. For most consumer products, a consumer is not a voter based on their use of a particular set of products. In fact, smokers largely vote against their best interest when it comes to electing people who may preserve access to the products or not tax them into oblivion. They've never, when we fight excise tax fights at the state level, there's rarely ever a bunch of smokers that show up and protest when they're trying to raise cigarette taxes. They never stand up for themselves because shame has been an effective practice for discouraging them from being excited about the use of these products. That's not the case with new generation alternatives like e-cigarettes. In fact, in 2016, we did polling in the United States for people above the age of 20 that showed 4 out of 5 voters, 4 out of 5 consumers of these products are single issue voters on the issue of where a politician stands on vapor tax and regulatory policy. And when you look at the number of consumers of these products, in excess of 8 million, that is a vote-moving constituency. And so while our government is getting regulation wrong, from Grover's perspective about the Leave Us Alone coalition, you've got the homeschoolers, the gun owners, the business owners who want to be left alone to make a lot of money. This is the newest and largest addition to that constituency. And we're seeing this around the world in terms of protest and opposition to this sort of stuff, which is interesting because we're creating new allies in the center-right, libertarian, and conservative world, which is why we're so excited about this stuff. So I'll end on that, which is that we're getting policy wrong, but politics is a great opportunity in terms of advocating for these free market principles, and we're creating new allies in the effort.
Thank you very much, Paul. Can I have the mic back or to pass it over to Gia? And now that we do the full circle, and since we're an advocacy group, of course, we want to learn from each other and see what works best and where we can put regulation down. Gia will do an effort in just presenting the Georgian case in 3 minutes. Because if I tell Gia 3 minutes, I know it will be 4. But do your best and prove that you can stick to 3 minutes. Because we want Q&A.
I think this microphone does not work.
It does. Just talk.
Do you hear me? No, it does not work. Oh.
No.
Okay, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to speak about our experience again, because we experienced really a lot of different things in my country, especially last 100 years, with the socialist and communist experiments, and then with the European Union experiments. So in 1990s, we had a kind of import of European experience to Georgia, and I was always asking myself, what were we abandoned Soviet Union when they are teaching us back how to have the socialism in our country? So one thing is very, for me definite, that some people are confusing, for instance, concept of the rule of law. When I'm thinking about this, the regulations cannot be the part of the rule of law, because regulations are always somebody decided about what they think about how to regulate our lives and the businesses. But definitely, for instance, the labor laws are against the rule of law and are against of the property rights. I want to buy some labor from somebody, and somebody is obliging to buy the labor of the other guy. This is against the property rights, because this is my money. I want to buy this labor, not that labor. In the case of the apples, I'm always bringing the apples example. Nobody is telling me that you should buy this apple, not that apple. And maybe sometimes also they do that. So what was the Georgian experience in 1990s? We just imported European laws, translated them into Georgian, and adopted 900 laws. My friend who was the Speaker of the Parliament, he was very proud of this. But then the next government was destroying all these regulations from 2003. Another good friend who unfortunately died also, Gacha Bentukidze, was just tearing down all these regulations. But what is the real life behind the regulations? I was the member of the many anti-corruption bodies and campaigns, etc. And I had only one prescription for decreasing corruption in Georgia, which was the #1 corrupted nation in Soviet Union. And that let's eliminate the regulations and there will be no corruption. This was like no regulation means no government offices and bureaucrats. No regulation means no bribe, no cost, no shifting of responsibility. Is it working? Okay. No regulation means no special interests.
Just speak.
Okay,
Yeah, but it's
switching on.
it's
Okay.
flickering.
Okay. No regulation means no special interests, no privileges, no lobbying, no artificial monopolies. No regulation means better private responsibility, better competition, better cooperation, better efficiency, and such kind of things. Okay. Then what was in Georgia? We were 132nd in the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, and after we eliminated 800 licenses and permissions during 1 year, 2006, we are now 42nd, far ahead of many European Union nations, for instance. And the other example is that last night there was a shortage of electricity for two hours. I was in my hotel, the city park, and I wanted to work, but there was no electricity. I did not know if I could go out of the room because without the key could not work after that maybe. But it was the same in Georgia, even much worse from 1993. That for 10 years there was no electricity because of many problems. But when we did the deregulation of the energy sector, then we became net exporters of the electricity. In just 2 years, instead of blackouts, instead of the shortage of energy, we became net energy exporter. In 2 years, we became the net exporters of energy. Can you imagine this? And how it happened that we introduced market discipline in energy, we depoliticized the energy sector, and we deregulated the energy sector. That means that anybody who is constructing now electric power station in Georgia, they can sell electricity to whom they like, with the price they like. That's the end of the story. Because if you tell them that you should sell this to Georgian consumers, and you have no right to sell it more than that price, etc., then there will be no investments in your energy sector. This is the very short story because Barbara is controlling me. But I think this is very, very, very impressive because we were one of the poor after the Soviet Union. During the Soviet Union, Georgia was the most flourishing because half of our economy was underground. But after that, our economy was destroyed completely. We became $300 per capita income country. But this deregulation helped us to grow much faster, double-digit growth. So this is our story. We want to bring this story to Africans, Asians, everywhere, that don't be afraid of deregulation. This is the only way to prosper. Thank you very much.
thank you very much, Gia, for sticking to almost the time, and presenting this impressive case. So we have seen the academic part, we've seen a practical issue that we will face in the industry, and we've seen how things can be done. Questions? Richard was the first, then James, and then sorry, yes. Okay. There is a microphone up here.
I don't think I need one.
Okay, go ahead.
My name is Richard, and I'm a nicotine addict. I think that's the way the way they start the various addiction things. And of course, I'm also a libertarian, so I'm in favor of anybody being able to kill themselves whatever way they like. But I will definitely disagree with your point about nicotine. I cannot talk to people who just begin their experimentation with the drug, or whether or not vaping leads to further nicotine. I cannot comment on that. I can only comment to those hardcore addicts like myself who use nicotine for a very long period of time, and then I can only say the choice is nicotine or no nicotine. There is no in between. You are either addicted to the substance, and from personal experience, having all my life experimented with any number of substances, this is the most addictive substance. So from my point of view, I am now clean. I have, as everyone can see, successfully transitioned from nicotine to other substances which are soon to be regulated, namely carbohydrates. But if you were to give me a nicotine gum or a nicotine or a vapor or a patch tomorrow, I would be back to 3 packs of Marlboro a day like that. And that's purely what we're talking about here with nicotine is not the substance itself, and you're saying, okay, the tobacco industry was regulated AB. Basically, what you're fighting over is the nicotine delivery system. It does not matter whether it's delivered by smoking or delivered by chewing gum or delivered by something. As far as I know, it's the only industry where you're talking about regulating the delivery system and not the substance itself.
Yeah, and maybe I didn't make clear that I agree with you. The debate is not about what form of nicotine is less harmful. It is the delivery mechanism. Whether it's smokeless tobacco, whether it's an e-cigarette, whether it's a heated tobacco product, on the risk profile for nicotine delivery, these are all products that are significantly less harmful than cigarettes, but are being regulated and taxed in some circumstances equally or worse. And so the debate around harm reduction is why. And while one product may not work for you, that's why you need a robust offering of countless products for consumers who do have an interest in transitioning, should that be of interest to them. But yeah, I mean, I agree that the question is not the risk of nicotine. The question is the delivery system.
Yeah. Well, yes, please, Gloria, then James, and then Octavian.
Yeah, I'm also a smoker. I smoked since I was 17, sometimes more and less in my life. But I've read books about quitting smoking, and the first thing that says is consider yourself a nicotine addict if you smoke a pack a day. If you smoke less than a pack a day, you're not a nicotine addict, you are just a combustion addict. One thing that the market is not considering is that some people, because I've spent 6 months without smoking, I've spent weeks without smoking, and I don't have the urge of nicotine. So the other aspect that the market is not considering is that there are people that we are addicted to combustion, to the lighting, and that is something that vapes and these products or gum don't take away from what you want. And if you only focus on the addiction of nicotine, which of course a lot of smokers have, but you don't consider that there
one cigarette and then be right back where I said.
Can we, James?
Right. I'd just like to just go back to sort of the original topic of this panel, which is how to deal with overregulation, because I think it's really, really interesting what's happening in a broader sense. I think a high degree of regulation, and to which I would add its cousin nudge, which is a lot of people say it's not regulation, but I'm going to nudge you that way, whether it be through a tax system, whether it be through various regulations. Ultimately, this really comes down to an enormous desire by a certain type of person to control and to guide others. And I think that it's really interesting what's happening in the broader political establishment, because I think people are rebelling against that. If you talk to the average sort of center-left person about what drove Trump, they're going to tell you it's something like, well, income inequality, and then if you have it too bad, you get Trump. And if you say to them, what drove Brexit, they're going to tell you absolutely it was all about migration. Neither of them are going to say, actually, it was people saying, hey, you, stop telling me what to do. Just you, bug off. I don't need you in my life. But increasingly, I think that is what drives it. And I think that what we have to recognize in this argument is that there's an enormous groundswell of people who are pretty tired of being told what to do. And they would like to not be told what to do. And they're perfectly happy making their own mind up. Christopher touched upon some of that in your presentation as well. And I think that's just something we should all be aware of, because it actually fits in with our point of view much, much more. People are more educated than they've ever been before, and they are less in need of government guidance than they've ever been before, and yet they're getting more of it. So perhaps it's time to play your strengths.
Octavian, is this related to what you wanted to say, or otherwise?
I will speed it up. I will change the perspective. I noticed from the screen that the apocalypse is close. You should see the message. So I want to.
No need. We are done today here.
The question of regulation and how to minimize the harm has a very simple answer. Mitchell used yesterday the expression economics 101. How can we drive down overregulation? By making the regulators compete among themselves for the grace of the regulated taxpayers. So I always put my students a very misleading dichotomy, which stands very high in the mainstream textbook of international economics or international political science. And this whole fake dichotomy, as I see it, is between the conflict between governments and the cooperation between governments. Some say that conflict is bad, which is obviously right, but cooperation among governments is not necessarily good. Cooperation among governments can be equated to a cartel of regulators, which when regulators cartelize themselves, this is a declaration of war against the regulated taxpayers. So bottom line, my observation is when we see at a TV station or on the anti-internet, the politicians shaking hands, or particularly in the case of Europe, when Jean-Claude Juncker kisses the forehead of another chief of state or slaps the butt, kiss the forehead and slaps the butt, not vice versa.
Kiss the ass and
This is not necessarily good news for the regulated taxpayers, because he may face regulatory accountability.
Okay. Anything to add? No. Wolfgang?
Just one question. I mean, the example of Georgia, which is now a couple of years ago, when you deregulated the electricity sector, and I mean, you mentioned it's a role,
Well, we are done.
almost a role model for other countries which suffer under power supply. How many takers are there so far who want to know about your story?
Thank you. In reality, many of Georgian reformers who worked in the previous government, not this government, unfortunately, they travel a lot from Botswana to Uzbekistan now. Uzbekistan is very fashionable now to go. And they are in Albania, they are in Azerbaijan. There was a lady who was working in Moldova, who is my friend. She was to help with the tax reforms. I'm not sure they all are very successful, because this is coming from internal power. If you want to change something, nobody can help you in this. And the first thing what I would offer, this is the same what I said 2 days ago. That first thing is to stop to listen to international advisors. They mostly tell you how to shift responsibility somewhere. The gentleman was talking about the regulation competition. I believe that they are competing how to make it even more complex, not vice versa, how to make it simpler. But what I mentioned in European Union, this is because I have a very good experience of Soviet Union, and I was comparing always Soviet Union with European Union in this sense, of course, is that when you are pushing down the regulations from Brussels towards any European Union nation, they are automatically shifting responsibility to you, and then they say that you would like me to have these regulations. Okay, now if there are consequences, you take the costs. This is how it works, and this is our experience in Soviet Union. That's why I'm saying it. Although our Georgia would be prosperous countries without Moscow, but they were pushing so much regulations, so much centralization that we became slaves, just slaves. Because slaves will always want to shift the responsibilities to others. The only freedom lover people like the response to take liberty and the responsibility together. This is our answer to this discussion in the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Is there one more question from the floor? Yes, please.
Just a quick comment. One thing that a lot of folks look at when they look at regulators is that their job is to regulate. And this conversation about incentives for regulators, a lot of countries are looking at ways to turn regulators into deregulators by changing the system to have regulators pay attention to costs and things like that, and have competition for finding cost savings and paying attention to regulatory budgets. This is an ongoing trend. Just wanted to offer that.
Well, thank you very much to the panelists. You see, we have a couple of challenges ahead with new topics, and again, our advocacy, I think, coalition will make it happen, or will make it possible that we don't have to fear for the worst, but we can kind of maneuver it. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to you. 2 quick announcements. Lunch will be served outside, Sergio, correct? The bus will leave from downstairs, of course, in front of the university.
As long as you have a passport.
Yes, only with a passport. So Victoria will be very strict. Nobody who doesn't show her passport at the door will be let into the bus. And second, if you don't have your if your passport, bring it. And most importantly, those who have not done interviews, go to Ignacy. This is the last opportunity. Ignacy has set up a camera. We want quick statements, why you're working in the movement, why you are, what are your biggest achievements, and what are your current topics that you face and that you work with. So thank you, and looking forward to our nice excursion later.